Hi. This is probably the last question you thought you would get, but I'm just interested if you could expand a little bit on what you were saying about ABA therapy. You know, a lot of us, I think, rely on it, and I personally have never heard anything bad about it. So when someone like you has a concern about it, I suspect you think there are good things and maybe bad things about it, but if you could just expand on that to let us know what we should avoid with it and take from it, that would be very helpful.
I'll take my mint out of my mouth so I'm more understandable. So let me differentiate between discrete trial training and ABA. So the principles of ABA are applied behavioral analysis. And I'm not as concerned about applied behavioral analysis because I do think we're all governed by the rules of behavior. When we model things and a child says something and we respond to it, we are actually reinforcing what they did, if we want to look at it from a purely behavioral point of view. Where I have much more of a difficulty, and when I look at the work of Gayle and we look at pivotal response, they are looking at behavioral, they're looking at teaching things within a context so that they're getting reinforced within that context, all right? But it's not a pure behavioral perspective. It's a much more of a generalized, how do I fit things within the context. Where I really fall off the ABA wagon is in discrete trial training. So in discrete trial training, they are putting a kid in a cube chair or in a cubicle, and they are drilling them in a set number of drills, and the child is given a particular SD, and they are expected to respond in a particular fashion. There is not much regard given to their sensory regulation. There is not much regard given to what they want to communicate. I've had discrete trial therapists say to me when I have a kid crying, I don't really care why she's crying, she has to do her work. The two areas that discrete trial training has never been successful with is building communication and building social skills. And if you look at the research, and of the areas that I'm most concerned about for the kids I work with, one group being autism, I'm very concerned about social skills and communication. My girls with Rett syndrome, kids with Angelman, kids with Down syndrome, I'm very concerned about their social skills and their ability to relate and also their ability to communicate. So I'm not going to use something that's going to teach them in these little teeny tiny sound bites and little teeny pieces of information that don't link up and also don't include communication. It's just SD response, SD response. So that's how I differentiate between the two. Do you have anything else to say?
Just that the stuff that I was talking about this morning in relation to pragmatics, the cues that they use to communicate are so odd in relation to real pragmatics. So for example, I have seen the example where you sit opposite someone you know and practice asking them, what's your name? Whereas pragmatically, you only ask someone their name if you don't know their name. So I'm not talking generally, but I think you really have to look at the pragmatics of everything when you're looking at communication. And you have to do that when you're looking in literacy as well. That learning in one context, you have to learn within the real mess of the pragmatics. Does that make sense? So take that, if you will. Yeah.
As a parent, what might we see someone doing wrong when they're performing ABA with our child? Drill and kill. That's basically it.
Drill and kill. So I have a young man that I'm working with currently who had a lot of very odd behaviors. And the minute I gave him way more communication, the odd behaviors dropped out to a certain extent, but they were still there. And then there was this period of time where all of the odd behaviors trying to get out of work and just doing weird things to distance himself from me went away. And he was just fully engaged. And I said to the mom, wow, he is doing so well. And then about 6 months later, these behaviors appeared again. And I said, what has changed in the environment that these things have come back? She goes, you know what? Our behavior, our ABA team, we lost all our people. So for 6 months, we had no DT. And that was when all the behaviors disappeared, and he just was engaged and was working. Now, this was unbeknownst to me, so this is like I was blind to this. And the minute he started back in his drills was when he had all of the behaviors to get out of doing things. So I've just never found it to be effective. The other thing I have a problem with is I have a problem with a system that's based on motor imitation when kids have apraxia. And I think that's not fair.
Can I step in here, coming as a person who's trained in ABA? I think I often hear a lot of confusion because ABA is good teaching strategies that all teachers use. And I think there's sometimes a confusion between ABA and discrete trial
That's what
training.
I just spoke to.
Right, because
just
that
said
discrete trial training is one piece of ABA,
Right.
but often people take that as a generalization of what ABA is. But within what I've heard talked about today, I've heard a lot of good applied behavior analysis principles,
Right.
modeling, scaffolding along the way. So I think it's sometimes confusing when we group
Right, and that's why.
ABA to mean discrete trial
Right, I
training.
try
'cause
to
that's just
separate
one
those
piece.
out, because I do think that we have to be aware, because I have kids who come to me who are using screaming to get what they want. I have to replace that with communication. That would be considered behavior. I mean, you have to analyze the behavior, you have to say, but I'm not a strict behaviorist, I'm not, but you have to do that to get to where you're going. But discrete trial training, if you're talking about getting ABA, typically what people talk about is discrete trial training. Is that what you're engaged in?
I was interested in all of that, yes.
Okay.
Can I just want to put a question out that's from our online viewers right now, and I think it's an interesting question, and hopefully it won't dominate the entire rest of the discussion, but she was taken by what David said about how there's no reason to symbolate text in order to teach someone to read. And then she said, I don't understand that. We discussed it a little bit, and hopefully we didn't confuse her too much. But then she said, well, then I don't understand why we're symbolating language on an AAC device. If we're not supposed to symbolate words, why are we not just using words on an AAC device? And I thought, well, now you're beyond my pay grade, so I'm going to bring that to the panel.
So the difference is, one is we're trying to teach reading, and one is we're trying to teach communication. That's the difference, is that if you're teaching reading, the symbols will confuse the word identification. Oftentimes the symbols support the communication, and the words are thrown in and might actually help a child learn that word. I mean, it might, but that's not the goal. And once a kiddo that I'm working with can read core words, I take the symbols away because they're using them to read them on their devices. But one goal is reading focused, the other's communication. Would that make sense?
Yeah, well, partly yes, but I used to do what you just said about taking the symbols away until I started modelling interactively within natural contacts throughout the day, and until the parents did that. And we actually find that if you have a lot of written words on a display, it actually makes it harder to quickly locate vocabulary, particularly when you're looking at beyond the core that is in the
Right, that's what I was just thinking, just core. Just core.
Yeah, so partly it is that the research tells us that what helps us locate a symbol quickly on a complex display is colour and shape differences in the symbol. And so the written words, you're not sort of following text like you are when you're reading, trying to find a written word, because they're also similar on a grid, can be a bit slower. And so a lot of the guys that I work with who read quite well, they select to keep their symbols on the display, or at least some symbols on the display that cue them into areas.
But just so parents are clear, it's okay if there's a word above the symbol that's on their display.
Yeah,
for
That's not gonna make it-
to use.
Right.
That's for us to use.
Can I just,
They use it too, yeah.
I just want to clarify, but in the sentence strip at the top, I've heard most people leave the sentence strip without the symbols at the top, even though the symbol and the word are paired on the symbol set page itself.
It would depend a great deal on your current fluency of reading, but also with how much you are using the symbols as your receptive language. So there are a number of children with auditory processing or hearing impairment who are dependent on reading the symbols in the message window at this time in their development to help them understand. So there isn't a general rule for that. But once people are reading and able to understand and use the text a little bit more,
For the
not
core
perfectly,
but for the core words,
so
like
that they can notice whether they got the wrong one in there, and that they've got more reasonable, then they take the symbols off in the message window.
So
Is
for
that-
like a word like is, because it's like 2 lines is the symbol,
Yeah.
it's like doesn't, I mean, if they
Oh,
can,
yeah. That's
for
just a
core
regular-
words. Or the, there's
Yeah.
a triangle and.
Yeah.
which
Yeah,
makes-
that's fine to take the
Right.
symbols off for those ones.
Right.
But then it's the shape of that word that's helping you locate it quickly. But if all the words look a similar shape, you get into more trouble and your modelling slows down.
I can only speak to literacy, and they can argue communication. But everybody I've ever spoken with has made this distinction at this point.
Yeah.
Symbols for communication, no symbols, use traditional orthography when you're working on reading and writing. I will put a link next to our handout and give it to Susan also to the research paper that the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies did a while ago. And I'll tell you what pages to look at in there for the research that says don't put symbols with text if you're trying to teach kids to read. I will also put up 2 slides, one with the print removed, and I would like you to open that slide and read it. When you think you know what it says, you should also probably put down how long it took you to figure it out. Once you see how long that takes you to get some kind of meaning, then go to the second slide, which will have the exact same symbols with the print. And what you'll find is while we thought, we thought as a field that symbols were helping you read better, in fact, your ability to read is why you thought it was helping. Right? You'll find reading the text quite simple, no text. It's really hard to figure out what it means, particularly if you're not somebody who uses these softwares on a daily basis. But we've done this with people who use the software
I couldn't
on a
do it.
daily
But I
basis,
couldn't do it.
and they can't read it.
So thank you all for amazing and informative presentations today. I was particularly affected by the graphic that someone used earlier, I think from Asha, about evidence-based practice being a sort of 3-legged stool of, academic research, clinical observation, and parent caregiver observation. And I was curious if you all could speak to the sort of academic peer-reviewed research side of that stool, and from your perspective, what is most useful from what's coming out of that work and what is most needed? What are the holes in our knowledge that need to be filled by that part of the work?
Well, I would say in the area of communication, the biggest hole is the long-term outcomes. That we always look at such little tiny isolated skills, and language is so much bigger and much more long-term than that. And so when we're looking at intervention strategies, we need to look at the long-term, and that's what we're really missing.
Mm-hmm.
It's the hardest to do. Communication's messy, and the long-term is harder to take dead on. But I think that's the biggest hole that we have in that area.
And even the intermediate long term, not as well as the
Yeah.
long term, because as Lighton McNaughton studies said, most of the studies were looking at a 6-week or less intervention period, which is hardly anything to help develop a communication system for someone with complex communication needs. So
It depends on what you want to call evidence. So if you want to define evidence narrowly, so what do we know about kids with Angelman? The answer is we need to know everything. There is no evidence. There's no evidence in the way that we talk about evidence-based practice in, for example, how you teach reading to children who are non-disabled, right? Now, we put in a proposal about a year ago to try and do some studies with this population. The reviewers didn't like it. We found one study that looked at one child with Angelman in a literacy context, and that wasn't even the focus of the study. So in terms of literacy, we need to know everything, if you define it narrowly. Mm-hmm. Susan and I have proposed, and I think other people, I think reasonable minds can agree, but can also disagree, that you can take evidence from what we've learned from working with complex kids, children who often have physical impairments combined with communication impairments, combined with sensory impairments, et cetera, multiple disabilities. And you can take studies like that and you can use them as starting places, evidence-based starting places, and then you need to look at the individual child that you're working with. So like, how is this kid different than who was studied? Mm-hmm. How is this classroom different, or how is this home different? And reasonable minds will do that. I think the risk, I worry about evidence-based practice as a researcher because it's put up as a gold standard. And the reality is when it comes to complex kids, we don't know anything. We don't know anything. What I try and do is draw on everything I know, that was researching literacy with anybody who was having trouble learning to read. Now, some people think that's sacrilege. I have colleagues that wouldn't do that. I could name them, I won't, I'm being taped, right? But I think it's really important to know how we teach. What I know about this field is there are not many reading people in it. I am. I can name a couple of others, like a handful of people that actually know anything about literacy that are doing literacy work with complex kids. So there's not much that we can say is evidence. Well, if you only have a handful of people doing research, you're not going to get an evidence base for a really long time, not in my lifetime, and probably not the next round of researchers' lifetime, and maybe not after that. But if you view it more broadly, right, so you look and you say, well, what do struggling readers do? What does emergent literacy look like in kids? And does it look any different in kids who are deaf? Does it look any different in kids who have cerebral palsy? Does it look any and if you start looking across things, you go, wow, looks pretty similar. How are we going to put a pencil in a kid's hands if he can't hold a pencil? And then we start looking at all these other writing opportunities, possibilities. Clearly, they changed the writing process. This is different than me saying yes, no, when you say, do you want A? Do you want B? Do you want C? But at least I gave you writing opportunity while the field at some point catches up to common sense practice. I mean, y'all are pioneers. That's just the reality. But if you think widely about literacy, if you draw on all kinds of populations, then evidence can inform. It should never restrict, because we just don't know enough. If you think about evidence with non-disabled kids, I worry about the fact that it's atheoretical. It has no theoretical base, right? And so it's just what works. That scares me, because what works when? For whom? Under what circumstances? When they have what need? That's what's not being answered. And so to say, well, we know that you should teach figured out summarization as a comprehension strategy to all children. Well, maybe not. Because that was, look at the studies. Who were they studying, right? And so it's more complex than, we tend on the outside to say, well, it's research, it must be good. There's a lot of crap out there, folks.
I think one of the problems too is when you go into school districts, so I do a lot of work in districts, and they say, well, where's the evidence? Where's the research for what you're suggesting we do? Which isn't really there. And then their answer to that would be to do nothing and sort socks. So at that point in time, I think what I try to talk about is I try to talk about what experiences we've had, what I can show you kids that have done this, and let's talk about a little history here. I didn't fall off the cart yesterday. So I think that's the direction. But I think all of us sitting here, one of the things that we were talking about, I'd love to do like a single child study, just a case where we can start to get some of the information that we're doing out there. So at least people are reading about kids and the progress they've made and what it looks like. It's not hard, cold research. It's not what researchers necessarily are looking at, but it will at least give us some kind of history of what's working with kids.
And that's why we have to remember that three-pronged model, that the research is only one of those pieces.
Right.
And we have the other pieces that we are basing our judgment and our
Our
interventions
practice
on.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
I got one leg, and that would be your kid. So the fourth leg is, how does your kid respond to those three sources of information when we put them together and try to teach something? How do they respond? And then let's problem solve thoughtfully in a child-centered way. Your kids can learn. They're hard to figure out. Right?
I think probably that's the piece I think that's most, problematic, and that we have to address as anybody who's at the university level training teachers, is the problem approach to thinking about kids. Because I think somewhere along the line, things have gotten really formatted. Largely that's a political issue, I think, because of all the assessment in America. It might be different than it is for you. But it's become so formatted that people are afraid to think about what to do when that doesn't work. And they tend to ride the horse way too long. I think, what do you say, 6 weeks? I've heard you say.
Yeah, my colleague has the 6-week rule. So you should try something with your kids for 6 weeks. For instance, somebody says, I got this great app. It'll teach your kid the alphabet. Try it for 6 weeks. Watch closely. Tweak it, day to day, tweak it. But in 6 weeks, you have to answer this question. Is it working? It's time to move on. Is it not working? It's time to move on. And so if you think in your head, so think about this, those of you who have these older kids who've been in the school system a long time, some of these kids are 18, their IEPs don't look any different than when they were 5.
Right.
What if the system had been doing a 6-week rule all along? Think of all the ways they would have tried to teach your child. And don't you think one of them would have worked? And wouldn't they have a different IEP at age 18? Right? And so for me, that's the challenge is we're going to keep moving. And we have to continually think, what's next? What's next? And we have to do that systematically, but we have to give each thing a good shot. And 6 weeks is arbitrary, but it's a reasonable amount of time. Make it 8.
Probably not enough time for ASC.
No. But you.
That's not what I'm saying.
Right.
I'm just clarifying.
Yeah. But you would see some progress, you would hope, in 6 weeks, something.
If they don't currently have an understanding of language,
Yeah, you would see
they
some
would
understanding.
need some.
Some understanding would start, I would think. Yeah.
I have a question about shared reading. I have several different resources that I use for language with shared reading. I have a page that's like an ALD, aided language display, or a bookmark that has symbols that are primarily related to any kind of shared reading experience. I sometimes have a page of symbols that are related to a specific book, and I have my son's device. And people have shown different ways of using all of these materials. Which do I use? I mean, I really want him learning to use his device, using his whole language in all of our experiences.
Want me to start?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so I just did a consult via phone, and I was talking to the AT speech therapist, and they said that they were doing guided reading. This was a guided reading question with this child, and they were talking to me about the vocabulary. And I said, well, then what happens to the vocabulary that you have up there? And they said, well, then we take it down, and then we put up the one for the next book. I said, so then what was the point of learning the vocabulary if they don't have access to it? So I tend to look at kids' communication as a system, and whereas I might have some individual pages when they're first starting out that go with books, I quickly move into them using whatever they have to communicate about the book. So if the book is about nature and I'm in Sonoflex, I'll go to the nature context, but they have their core words and they have their Patty Judy pages or their their phrase-based pages, so they can make quick comments, but it's all embedded in what's there. Because if we start to take them outside to separate pages too much, they never learned what's in their system, and then it doesn't generalize to when they could use it other ways. But I have to say that when kids are young, little, I have done some topic-based things to get them up and started and to help families feel more comfortable in doing it, which I also think is really important, and staff. And then, but quickly kind of come back and say, okay, we're going to put it within their system. This is where you would find it.
We have, also we would mainly use the system. However, there are some groups of kids in some environments where, as an environmental accommodation for speed, say in a mainstream classroom doing guided reading. So if you look within the pod apps, the pod compass page sets, in the school sections or from the preschool sections, there will be book display blank grids where you can fill in more story-specific vocabulary for participation at a faster rate then you might be able to get access to some of the fringe vocabulary. Because some of the vocabulary that might be in the story would be more extended fringe, but you actually want to be able to participate with that vocabulary during the book more efficiently. So by having that vocabulary in the story-specific display for that interaction, or a direct link to maybe a subsection that would have had to go into a section first, straight from that page. Am I making sense? So it might have been tools. You could put the link to tools straight there, so they didn't have to go to get it, so that they can increase the speed of their participation during that guided reading activity. Critical to that is teaching the key communication partners to, at the end of using a story-specific display or a topic display, and often it's not everybody in the world, but there's someone, often mum or maybe a speechy or someone, who every now and then comes in with the child, does a clean-up. And what they do is they just make sure that any vocabulary that was on a topic-specific, subject, story-specific page, we work out together where it goes back into the main system. Because it might go back in deeper in the system, because it's very rarely extended vocabulary. The other group that we always use story-specific displays were even like tech early on is our deaf children. If they're not surrounded by people who are 100% fluent in Auslan or Australian Sign Language or whatever sign language. So because their language is the symbols, so we have to use the symbols like we use our speech, reading the text or reading the book or participating in the story. So those guys who have difficulty understanding spoken language, we would also use more story-specific displays for the language that goes with the text, that goes with the story.
I'd encourage you to look at the core vocabulary research work that's being done at the center. There are links now to materials, to some ideas for using it. And I would say whatever you're doing, make sure you're incorporating core vocabulary. So for example, I see kids' devices all the time who are beginning communicators. And inevitably when people are reading stories with them, one of the symbols is turn the page. Right? I raised 3 boys. The youngest is now a junior in college. They could all speak. I read to them daily for most of their lives. Not once did they ever tell me to turn the page. Not once. On the other hand, one of the core vocabulary words is go. So if you think they need to say turn the page, couldn't they say go? Because they could say go meaning, come on, let's get to the next page. They could also say go, I want to go home. Go, get me my toy. They could use go, right? It's core vocabulary. And so I would just say be real thoughtful about that. And core vocabulary, no matter what you think, this frequency stuff is critical to your kids, no matter what the system is. The frequency with which they use it increases the odds that they will actually be communicators. The problem with Fringe that we had forever was it's here today and gone tomorrow, and they never learn it. And so you're always pointing and modeling, but they never have a chance to learn. So you got to have something to build on, that's all.
Can I just say, of course, the pod page sets, the story-specific displays have the core on them anyway.
Yeah,
okay?
right, no, I know, yeah.
So they're
No, I
not
said,
mutually
any system.
exclusive concepts. Yeah.
Hi, my son Theodore is 2.5 and loves books, loves magazines, loves ebooks, loves printed pages, loves the words, but he destroys them. He mouths everything. He tears pages up, he tries to chew them, and I genuinely feel this is his way of interacting and learning. He gravitates towards certain books that are his favorites. Do you have any advice on how to get away from that habit, because we like our books, but also honor his way of learning? And then, I'd love to get to that point where these kids, every kid in these videos was focused and still, and if Theodore is not tearing a book apart, he scoots away. And I continue to read to him, assuming that he's paying attention to his mother, but can you help me bridge that gap between either him holding and destroying a book and mouthing it to death, or me reading to him and beginning to convey those kind of literacy concepts that you guys talked about today?
Yep. They'll have lots of ideas. My smart aleck comment is at least you have a voracious reader.
He eats like a teenager, so you're totally right.
Yeah. You all want to talk about communication symbols or sets that you might do to make the activity more meaningful to him. Part of this is, I don't know.
Part of this might be his sensory processing, like his sensory need to touch, to feel, to eat, to mouth. So sometimes you can have a look at whether there are other things that you can be mouthing while you're reading the book. So you've got a chewy or something, if
you say to
the
take
reason for it is a sensory need, you have a reading chewy chew or a chewy chew that you have a go at, while you're bringing in the book as well. So I'm meeting my need to chew. Anyone else? It could be a range of other reasons as well.
So you
can
would
say-
problem solve. That's a great idea,
Yeah.
right? So if it's sensory need, that would resolve it, right?
Yeah.
But you
If
might
it's
want to
something
give him
else.
some deep pressure beforehand, like ready his body to not just his mouth. But
Yeah.
one of the things I learned from the girls with Rhett that I was working with is some of them have a lot of movement. And it's a lot of random movement. And people felt, oh, maybe that's what they need for their sensory system to regulate is the movement. And then I started really looking at more and more of them and realizing, you know, the apraxia means that they can't start movement, but it also means that once they get started, they can't stop movement. And I started looking at seating and really getting good supported seating for my kids that some might feel is a bit restrictive. But what I found is that when they were in good seats, they relaxed and they were so much more available for learning that a lot of the struggle that can sometimes then become a game, it gets, you know, you run away, I come get you and pull you back, and I'm trying to engage you and you're running away, may not be purposeful, but can become purposeful, but might be helped if they're feeling supported in their bodies. So I think that's the other thing I would suggest is to take a look at a PT and look at some seating options that make sense. And since that's hard in the beginning, really small sections of time, but I've found a lot of success with good supported seating.
He does, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Also, sometimes one of the kids we work with has Angelman's. Of course, he's learnt to do this over time. He has arm wraps and leg wraps, splints, whatever you call them.
Yeah, those.
And so they give a
can't
very secure, and he
Direct
now
question.
will request those
Yeah.
before he sits down to do something.
Yeah.
So he has the language, his communication system. He can say, I need a sensory activity, or put on my arm wraps and leg wraps, and then he can calm a little bit. So each child, you would have to look at what it is that calms them.
But you wouldn't want them ultimately eating books. We totally agree with you. Yeah.
Here's the problem-solving process. So what I would do with my students to try and figure this out, we would spend a period of time observing, right? So we'd want to watch. Does he do this always? No matter what time you're reading, at all times of day, no matter what's preceded it. So when is this occurring? Does it happen at the very beginning of the reading and continue? Does it happen 2 minutes in? We just want to observe. And we'd write descriptions of what we're seeing. Not why we think it, just
Right.
what we see, right? And you could do the same thing.
Right.
Once we've done that for a period of time, I think a week is reasonable, more than one day, right?
Right.
Once we've done that, then we take a look at those descriptions, and we say, is there a pattern here? Is there one that jumps out at us? And you'll be the answer, you'll be the authority, right? You're his mom, you know him best. You might get to one and you go, I think that might be it, let's try that, right? So you have a hypothesis, in other words. And now you make a decision. Given what you think is causing it, now you make your action. And you try it for a period of days, probably not 6 weeks. But you try it for a period of days and you watch, and you try it at different times with different books, and you find out, well, it's reduced now under some circumstances, or it's worse, or it's just the same. And now you begin the cycle again. So the problem-solving process is observe, describe, hypothesize, make a decision, try it out, and do it again until the problem is resolved. And I do think it's a resolvable problem. It's not an unusual one. It usually isn't one that, once kids learn to communicate, once people figure out sensory stuff, once seating is addressed, often those kinds of things are reduced because now I got a way to say, I don't want to read anymore, maybe, or I don't want this book, maybe, or I can't concentrate when I'm not sitting in my chair, right? And those get answered over time. It doesn't seem to be irresolvable, although it is a pain.
Have you
And good
seen-
for you for reading to him.
Yeah.
Have you seen how some people have adapted their favorite books? I think Yvonne and Kaylee have done this with a lot of books, cutting the pages out of the binding before the child has had the chance to eat the books, cut the pages out of the binding, and then laminate, and then rebind either with duct tape or electrical ties. And then you have to sacrifice the book, but that's what you have to do.
No, that's smart.
But then you have a book that lasts a whole lot longer that you can allow the child to enjoy in a lot of different ways, and it's not quite so heartbreaking because you've chosen to do that with the book to make it more accessible for your child.
Good idea.
Here's one more possibility. We worked with adults with complex needs in a, unfortunately, North Carolina still has very large residential facilities. So these are really complicated adults that are so complicated they can't live at home, but there are hundreds of them. We wanted to introduce literacy because they had pretty boring lives and support communication. One of the things that they were doing, and I didn't get to stay there, but one of the things they were doing was using large plexiglass sheets and putting that between whatever it was the person would destroy, because they just didn't understand what was going on, and the person, right? And so if you could potentially have a book behind that, and so when he went to destroy, he couldn't get it.
Have that barrier.
Right. That might be some place, again, that's a hypothesis, you know, like you can try that out. It may be that once that happens, now I'm so frustrated I can't continue. It may be that I just do this and now I can read, because now I don't have my hands getting in the way of my learning opportunity. Maybe, right? And so you can play with ideas like that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Your kid picked the right mom.
Hi there. First, I just want to say thank you. It's so wonderful to have all of you here with us today. We really appreciate it. So I totally get what you guys were saying about not symbolating text for reading purposes. What I'm curious about is using AAC for writing. So my daughter is a pod user, and we've been doing some predictable chart writing, and she also gets access to the full alphabet at times, but for predictable chart writing with in our communication circle with typically developing peers, we found that she can participate in the writing process more efficiently with AAC. But just hearing everybody talking about like staying away from the symbols with reading just made me wonder what your thoughts were about using AAC for the writing process.
But now, is she actually writing, or is she just contributing what she wants written?
She's contributing, so she's doing the
She's
cognitive
saying,
aspect.
here's my turn in the
so
predictable
I
chart.
like dogs.
Then she's using the pod.
Yes, she's
right?
using the pod book to
No,
do
I'm
that.
saying she should use the pod.
Okay.
Right? Because she's talking.
Right.
The other kids are talking, she's talking with her pod. Mm-hmm. You use symbols for communication. Right? She's communicating what she wants you to write on that chart. Right?
So
You're writing,
Are the
physically
other kids
writing.
doing that too? The other kids are contributing verbally to the chart.
Well, the other kids in her communication circle are also using a pod book because they're all learning the pod with her. So they're all writing, they're telling their story using the pod book.
But the
and then
teacher's writing it.
the teacher,
Yeah.
I think, I'm not always, because I'm not always in the room, the day that I did it with them, I started scribing what all the kids were writing using pod, but then the kids that could write wanted to write theirs down. So I was scribing for the kids who would prefer to have someone scribe for them, and then there were some kids that would go up to the chart and write their own sentences. I've done that all of one time, but I know that they're doing predictable chart writing more often now in her communication circle, so I just...
Yep. She'd use the pod to make her contribution to the chart. The teacher would be doing the writing.
Mm-hmm. Great.
That's efficient and important.
Okay.
But then she would also have opportunity to use the full ABC to write.
Yeah, and other, like in writing without standards, kind of self-selected writing situations, she
Right.
might use that, yeah.
So that she can go beyond the pod someday.
Right.
Right? When she wants to call you a bad word that you didn't put in the pod, she's allowed to, and then she gets in trouble.
Right.
Like any other child,
everybody else.
right? But she has the opportunity.
Right.
She wants to make up a word, she wants to talk about a movie she saw 20 years ago, she can do it.
We've had a huge amount of experience with this, and what we have found is that depending on how many balls kids are juggling, it's absolutely critical that they have experiences from a very young age with the alphabet. Absolutely agree with that. Write stuff down, people scribe your letters, play with a full alphabet, sort it out for your access on high tech as well, write, print it out. But also for some children who are in school, in mainstream schools, who are juggling a lot of language still when they start school, as well as language like their grammar, their syntax, their morphology is still new. We find that there are some children who will develop better syntactically and feel more positive about writing if they're left to be free in some instances where the focus is on generative writing to choose whether they use the alphabet or their whole words. What we then find is that children will flip generally to use the alphabet over time. And then they might just flip back into their pod for the words that they've got no idea just at the moment how to generate. So there are other guys who find it extremely challenging to spell and generate simultaneously for whatever reason. And so some guys stay more with writing. So in my opinion, writing is more than the spelling. It is the word generation, the idea generation, the communicating on paper. And so whilst it is critical, because you can never develop spelling if you don't get that experience, it's not going to magically come out of anywhere. If you mandate spelling for certain of our kids, writing becomes so hard that I don't feel like that what I'm getting down on the paper is my genuine idea. So using the whole words as part of that process seems to keep their enthusiasm and energy for that.
Reasonable people can disagree. I would tend to take dictation from that child and write it for them, and they could use their pod as fully as they chose, choosing the whole words they'd like to choose. What I don't want to do is provide them with choices, right? So I often watch people who do call it writing and use something like a clicker grid, where they provided the vocabulary, and all the child's doing is the technology equivalent of magnetic poetry, right? Now, I've never seen an illiterate person create a poem with a magnetic poem, and I don't see writing with clicker. If I've got pod,
I think of it as the same as someone using Dragon.
Yeah. But I would take
think,
dictation.
Sometimes someone might use Dragon to write. When it's a pod, it's that, even though, yes, it might not have every word, it's big in terms of its vocabulary. You can be generative. You can say an awful lot of things, and not only pod, but if it's min-speak, if it's something big, robust. And we have huge amounts of experience where kids do end up just flipping over to the alphabet as well. Maybe Dave didn't meet them in Australia because they didn't go to Literacy Camp because they were already literate. but yeah.
The issue is this. For kids who
people will disagree here.
Right. No. But here's the thing. I think we want to get to the same end point. We would do it slightly differently. I don't. What I want you to do is be really systematic as you do that. To be really systematic as you do that, and watch. So, do you actually see people flip? I don't. What I see are those 8th and 9th graders who are really good communicators, and I have seen this since the late 80s. I saw it initially in Toronto when all those adults were really good bliss symbol communicators, and they were illiterate. They couldn't read and write text. But you give them a bliss symbolated text, and they could communicate. But there are only 4 bliss symbol books in the whole world. So what are they going to read for the rest of their lives? But they were great communicators. And since then, I've seen it with every other device. We can teach kids to communicate. We had one in camp this summer. He's from Michigan. He's an 8th grader. That kid could be a valedictorian. He's a freaking genius. He's interactive. He's eloquent. And you ask him to write something that's not in his device, and he looks like a kindergartner. That's inexcusable, because that kid is smart enough to spell anything he wants. He wrote me a letter last week, and he told me while he hated doing writing without standards, that he was getting better and that he'd written the whole letter to me by spelling, right? So he understands the value. He wouldn't hate it if we had been doing it with him when he was a preschooler and continued it. The problem is the response to the writing, not to the writing activity itself.
Dave, I'm telling you that some of our kids who we did it with, maybe we were scribbling with them too young, but they're been using the alphabet since they were 1 and 2, playing with it. They get to 4 and 5, and they're used to, in speech, being able to say what they want to say. They start to get frustrated that when they are trying to say something in writing, they can't put it all together.
But that
And
would be
we've
like
got
any other
evidence
kid,
of
wouldn't
lots and lots and lots and lots of kids flipping, so don't
But
worry.
I think
about
that's
it.
typical for 5-year-olds. I mean, I just from my grandkids,
Yeah.
watching them learn to write, it's hard work for typical, neurotypical. One of the things that I've been doing, which he might hate and they might hate, so I'll sit in the middle, we'll see. I'll take where the
Yeah.
chips might fall. I have a little girl, well, a few kids that are right now in kindergarten, fully included. And as they learn their sight words, which is a part of kindergarten, along with their making words, they've got sight words, they have to learn how to spell them using their ABC flip book with me, and they also have to find them in their core word flip book. I have a core word flip book. And when we're writing, they get a choice between their core word flip book and their spelling, so that it can speed up some of the access, and they can start to say like I like, and they find the I like in their core word flip book, and then they spell whatever they like. So it's a compromise, because I think sometimes there's fatigue, there's getting something out when you're sitting at the writing table and everybody's writing something and you want to write something. But I know it's very different to say something, because I've seen my neurotypical granddaughter create elaborate stories when she was dictating to me, and when she had to write them down, they became very simple, and it was hard work. But I think it's that hard work that makes better writers. So it's kind of like a compromise position, to give them some core words that they can use, but they're words, they're not symbols, they're core words, organized in a predictable way, and then they spell.
Thanks, everybody.
I didn't get hit by anybody on that one, so I think I'm,
Throw a spelling prediction in the mix,
there we go.
and you have another solution.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for all what you've done for all of us. Second, I just want to know one simple thing, because I have a son who is 20 years old, who has a scholarship in basketball in University of Hawaii, and we have also a daughter which one is 18, and she has Angelman syndrome. My question is very simple. How we can bring you closer to the school? How we can fight this system? Because my wife, for years, and we were fighting district to teach our kids, to teach our daughter. And I'm willing to spend my own money to bring you to our district. And I just want to know how much this is going to cost to train those teachers, you know, to teach them something. Because we don't need the babysittings. We need the teachers.
So
Thank
I hear an accent. Where do you live?
We live in Los Angeles.
Okay.
Just obviously we are from Europe.
Yep.
And we lived 25 years in Los Angeles.
Well, then it's a lot more affordable than all of us consult. And that's probably not a conversation on a microphone.
That's at least I can do for my daughter.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, just come see us after.
Thank you.
I just want to say there's some kids who were fully included from kindergarten. They've graduated high school. They are literate. They can spell. They can do math. And they weren't provided any sort of modification. They were placed in the classroom. It was assumed that they were taking in the info, and they were. And the parents didn't know until later that they were taking it in. But they presumed competence. And I just want, you know, some people are newly diagnosed and they're not aware of that. And I just wanted to share that little piece of info.
Evidence says kids who have parents who intervene effectively can learn to read. Kids who have teachers who intervene effectively can learn to read. The best situation is when both parents and teachers are on board in the same way. But what I'm telling you is that even if you're unhappy with what's happening at school, if you continue to support your child at home, you will make progress.
Yeah, and we have a new teacher this year, and she's really great. And, you know, we're still making progress. So, you know, I'm not completely dissatisfied, but I just want to try to continue to guide them in a new direction. You know, medicine is considered a practice. I think literacy and communication should be considered a continual learning process, too.
There's new stuff all
We
the time.
agree. We're all still learning.
Yeah.
I learned today.
I have a question that's probably a technical, hopefully kind of easy question, and it goes back to the writing without standards. And I loved what you said about having the kids take ownership of what they've written. I think that is really, really important. My son's, what is felt to be the most ideal alternative pencil for my son, and what I think he prefers as well, is the whole alphabet on a keyboard. And in his classroom, that then is used to generate what he writes on the computer screen. So I'm curious how you would suggest having them use his own alternative pencil, which is again the computer on the screen, to confer meaning onto what he's written, while not just writing it on what he's written. I think what typically happens is he has a picture on there, he writes something, and then the teacher says, oh, I think, they might say, Jay, maybe you're talking about such and such, or I can take this T to, a number of different ways to impart meaning to what he's written, but it then gets typed below and then printed off. But I'm not sure how else, in the interest of time, and in the desire to bring it all together and have it all visually available, how else you would suggest doing that?
We're talking about Ethan.
We're talking about Ethan.
And he's emergent, at least unless he's changed radically from
Well,
when I
Karen
knew him.
called him emergent and on the cusp of conventional literacy, and we've been
Great.
in that euphoria ever since, so.
She's right. Whatever she said is right.
We'll agree.
Yeah, I would, and when he's writing, do you have the talking word processor turned on?
I hope they do, I'm not sure.
And you would set it at the letter level and the word level for Ethan. So at the letter level, every time he types something, he'll hear the letter name. So he'll learn letters as he's just writing without standards. At the word level, as long as somebody's taught him that space bar, and he has access to that plus the letters, I would want to get rid of all the other keys until he was demonstrating more intentional use, right? So I don't want all the numbers and all the punctuation and all of that stuff. It's gone.
I'm not sure how
IntelliKeys,
they
for
can
example.
turn that off.
Well, IntelliKeys, right? Or some adaptive
I'm
keyboard.
not sure.
Okay.
I think they may just be sitting
Given
on
a
regular
choice.
keyboard.
Yeah, and there may be ways to address that, but those two levels, right? Letter level, word level. So when he hits space bar, the computer tries to talk, right? And if he has a vowel in there, it says a word, tries to say a word, right? So the way digital synthetic speech works is, if I see a vowel, I'm going to treat this configuration of letters as a word. So if he writes BBB, it's going to say BBB. If he writes BAB, it's going to say BAB. Not a word, but the computer thinks it's a word because it's got a vowel, right? And so he'll get different feedback depending on what he types. He'll become more aware of vowel use. His words will start looking more conventional. He'll use more white space, among other things, as he does those things. But the place to teach him is not when they're teaching him. The place to teach him about writing is not during that time, right? So I would do the things I proposed. I would give the feedback. I wouldn't say, I think you're trying to write and write a sentence. I would teach him I'd do predictable charts to teach him those things. I would do alphabet instruction. I would do the other areas that we talked about today to teach him the skills that then in writing without standards, you'd start to see reflected, right? You would see more in, so go ahead.
But you said with the writing without standards, your next step, you take out a Post-it note. And
Right.
you then,
Right,
and you
and I
said
would
you
do
use
what I
their
said.
alternative pencil to then write what you thought, or make
To
some
model
sort of comment
a word
about it.
related to the topic he's writing on.
So print
But would
out
you
his-
still,
Print out his paper and use his paper on another piece of paper, another screen, your writing, write with it and staple it together after you've printed it to get out.
Or take
So
a
it's not
picture.
on the
Is that
same
what she's
thing.
asking? Okay.
So it's a
Yeah.
separate, your writing and his writing, but he can compare them. So you're still using his pencil,
right?
but not on the same piece of paper or the same screen.
But the other thing that David was just saying is the reason the other blocks are important is that they're feeding or supporting his ability to be a better decoder and a better writer. So I know that when I'm doing rhyming or when I'm doing alliteration with sounds, all of a sudden the kids start to do B, 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 B. Where before they only pick the first one. All of a sudden they're saying B when we've just read something about a ball. you know, or I've read something about, like the girl who did tree, and it was T-A. You know, she had the T, she just had the wrong vowel. So you start to see the effects of what you're doing showing up in writing. I think writing is really probably our most diagnostic tool, because you start to look at writing and it shows you what they know about sounds, what they know about words. And I understand what you're saying about ideas. I think the way we get at ideas is maybe we help kids with their communication devices flesh out and use some of the graphic pre-writing things that we typically do with kids. What they're doing with kindergartners when they're doing like a writing short mini lesson, you start to show them how to plan out, but then when they go to write, they just write. But, you know, I think that's how they learn to be better writers. Not by just doing the same thing on a keyboard every day. They have to have the other pieces.
And also, just based on our discussion the other day, another critical part will be syntax in writing. So actually having some certain structure behind what you're trying to spell, what you're trying to say, you know, whether you have that internally or not. A lot of people think complex thoughts, but they're actually not thinking word by word, which is something an AAC user needs to do.
Hi. So I have a question about using, we use a flip chart for writing, Pod for writing. I made a QWERTY board, and then we use Post-it notes for and a whiteboard. So I'm thinking maybe we have too many things that we're modeling. But we use like the whiteboard and the Post-it notes for spelling, for sight words. And I'm just wondering if that's okay to do with just choices, or should we just be sticking with one model, like the alphabet flip chart and then the pod?
Did you get yes to the 4 questions? All 4?
Did I?
So when I showed you the decision tree, did you answer yes to all 4 for your child?
No.
Okay, then I'm not working on spelling.
Because he's not conventional, he's emergent.
That's conventional instruction.
Okay. Well, I know she can spell, so maybe I should look at the 4 things, because she has spelled pretty big words that, you know, she's spelled 3-letter words, and she's also in English, and she's spelled, she's in Spanish immersion, so she's also, like, her first word was galletas, and it was phonetically spelled, but not, you know, correct, but.
I bet you got 4 yeses.
Okay, probably, maybe.
Okay. I don't know how you want to answer all the different writing tools. I don't personally have a problem with multiple writing tools. I think kids need to I think you need to observe what's working best for her and spend more time with what seems to be working best. But from a writing perspective, that's my only feedback to the question.
It would depend for me on how good the visual system was and the motor planning system, because I do think that if you have poor motor planning and a poor visual system, then it might be confusing to go from a QWERTY to the ABC flip book where you're actually having to do 2 hits to get to a letter. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like 2 different alphabetic layouts. I've had experiences with a lot of CVI kids, and moving from one keyboard to the next is a nightmare. And so we're really very thoughtful about what we start with.
Okay.
Because having to change can really create chaos. One of the boys I'm working with now, we have to change. He's using a floor keyboard where he's being supported and he's walking to letters, because when he's looking down, he can see better than when he's looking up. The problem is he's now 135 pounds and it takes 2 people to hold him up, and it's not tenable in high school. So we're going to the flip book, and changing to the flip book is taking so much instruction and so much step back that, you know, mom sees it as regression. It's really not regression. He still can spell. It's just that he's using a different tool. So I tend to not have my tools be so different. If one's their communication system, fine, and then they have another tool for writing. But I think there's a big difference between a flip book and a QWERTY keyboard, that from a visual and from a motor planning point of view.
It's probably also, you know, even if this particular individual, that's not throwing them off, sometimes finding out why you need to use the flip book if you are already engaging with the whole alphabet. I know sometimes it's just because they've seen somebody do. The example they saw on the video was a flip book.
Shiny ball.
and it's a shiny ball.
Right.
And so you can tell them, Dave, you can tell them it's okay to do exactly that you saw on the video with the flip book with a QWERTY keyboard. Does that?
Right.
Yes.
So sometimes it may be just that's the image they had of the academic activity.
Okay.
And
And see what works. But I
what
think
works.
it's two different things
probably
is hard.
sounds like it's not hurting him, but whether it's helping, I don't know.
Okay.
Can I ask you a question while you're there? How are you teaching spelling?
How are we teaching spelling? Well, that's through the multiple choice. So if we're, you know, like she gets English words actually in for her sight words, and so we will hold up like 3 letters, and just ask what comes first, what letter comes next, and then we would write down whatever she spells.
Uh-huh.
So she's having a closed set to do spelling.
Yeah. Try replacing
Yes.
that. Try
But
to
she also does, in school, she does the free writing, where
Yeah.
they use the flip chart, and
Yeah.
that's where she chooses whatever letters.
Yeah. Given what you've said, I'm guessing you got 4 yeses. So I'm going to assume that. If you find a no, then ignore what I'm about to say. But I would look at the making words strategy that Patricia Cunningham has developed. You can buy her books used, paperbacks, for $5 to $10 on Amazon. Don't buy them new. You don't need them new. You just need the materials.
Okay.
And I would replace what you're doing with the making words strategy, right? And the place to start, until you know better, is what she calls month-by-month phonics for kindergarten. Don't let your daughter see the cover. Just use the materials. And follow the strategies. The first couple lessons are scripted, so you'll sort of know how to do them.
Mm-hmm.
But after that, you've got it. I mean, and then the rest of them are just the materials. Try that strategy. I think you'll find that your daughter learns to spell faster and is able to generalize more. You'll see it more in that writing without standards. If you have an emerging kid, ignore everything I just said. Truly. It'll be appropriate when they're conventional.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
All right. Oh, we do have a question in the back, yeah?
Just as a follow-up there, could you comment on dual language or bilingual homes in terms of writing and literacy?
We just talked about that.
The question's about bilingual
Bilingual.
homes and literacy and communication.
Go ahead, Susan.
So here we go. We answered this question earlier when somebody asked us. I think there's no really good research out on it, to tell you the truth, but depending on the languages, I think that people learn to read in 2 languages all the time. One of the things that I have my families do that come to see me that are dual language families is I tend to put the books in whatever language is going to be in the schools, what the schools are learning. And then if there's another language that they're using, then they can do some follow-up work at home there. But I'm pretty committed to the kids learning to read in the language that's going on at school. Now, that isn't to say that I don't do both. So I have a family who's Japanese, living here in America. They don't want the child to lose their Japanese. The child has Rett syndrome. They don't want her to lose her Japanese. So what we've done is a compromise. On Monday, they speak only Japanese and read to her in Japanese. And on Tuesdays, they speak to her in English and they read in English and they model everything in English. The difficulty comes sometimes in some of the language systems because the order of things is different depending on the language. You know, in the OGCOM system, the order of how words would be located to make sense is different. And I'm not an expert there. I've only been working with some families that were doing some translating in French and some in Spanish. And I'm by far no expert. So we're just at the experimental stage, but that's kind of how we've divided it because they want their kids to be fluent in both.
What 2 languages are you concerned with?
English and Spanish?
Okay. And then the other piece of the answer was, so as you're in from a literacy perspective now, as you're trying to teach reading and writing, I would be inclined to do more with phonetics and letter sound stuff in Spanish because it has no exceptions, right? One letter, one sound. To develop the concept of how letters and sounds go together. Once that was established in Spanish, then I'd go to English where there are many more exceptions, but now the concept would be firm. And so I could deal with exceptions more easily, right? And so I would just look at the 2 languages, but anytime it had to do with spelling or decoding, I would want to be doing it in Spanish initially until the concept was firm in the child's head. And then I'd go to whatever the other language.
The one thing that you can't use is rhyme, because you don't have rhyme in Spanish, correct? Words don't rhyme, like cat, bat, sat, hat, fat. No rhyme.
I don't know, I don't speak Spanish.
I don't think there's any rhyme. This is what I've heard from families that I'm working with, that there's not a rhyme in Spanish. You can't use rhyming as a way to help with the decoding, but because it's one letter, one sound in Spanish, it's much easier. Where in English, you can use rhyming to help with the patterns in the language. Does that make sense? I know
Apparently
there's rhyme in
there's a Spanish rhyming dictionary.
Oh, so there is.
Top 20 Spanish rhymes on YouTube.
But I don't know if they-
All right, I think that wraps everything up. I am so grateful to all of our speakers for making all of their trips, some of them shorter, some of them halfway around the world, to be with us today.
40
I
minutes
think
from
we've covered some wonderful topics, and I'd like everybody to give them a final round of applause and gratitude.
Thank you. Thank you.